well, because one of the reasons that under his government deficits are now 3 times what they were when Labor was in government and debt is substantially higher by about a third is precisely because tax revenues are down dramatically. Now, he might believe in a Laffer curve and that there's some magic growth which spurts forward from a cut in taxes across the board, but that's not how economies work anywhere else in the world, and they don't work like that here. And at the heart of these appropriation bills is, as I said before, the Prime Minister's determination to implement what is a pretty extreme program of trickle-down economics. What do I mean by that? The notion that if you give more to the rich, either individuals or wealthy corporates, that they will somehow take that money, wisely invest it, create greater growth, which will sprinkle down on everybody else. And of course it has been trickle-down economics of the variety espoused by the member for Hughes that has produced such a tragic outcome in the greatest democracy of them all, which in the last 30 years has seen a hollowing out of the middle class and the creation of a great army of working poor. And thankfully that didn't happen in this country during that 30-year period, half of which was presided over by Labor governments. And it most certainly did not happen in this country during the Great Recession, which sent other countries into recession, which smashed their labour markets and destroyed the capital base of those economies to the point that many of them are still recovering. Our structural intervention meant that we secured our economy, we secured our people. And as a consequence of that, we can have a conversation about a healthy economy and how we might like to reform it in a way in which no other developed economy in the world can begin to have that conversation. Now, all of these matters were not addressed by the Prime Minister on the night of the election. Now, I would have thought by the time he got to the Sofitel on election night, he might have been able to think of some uplifting words he could have said to the nation. After all, Australia's longest election campaign had been all his idea and his alone. And at the core of that campaign was a commitment to a $50 billion unfunded corporate rate cut. Now, he had a long time that night to think of a few fine and inspiring words he might have said to the Australian people. He is claimed to be one of the most polished and accomplished speakers in the country. Now, by the time he got to the stage in the wee hours of July 3, his speech was about as appetising as the cold spring rolls and the stale champagne that have been circulating in the Sofitel ballroom for about 5 hours. That speech by the Prime Minister that night will go down as one of the worst speeches in history by a leader of any major political party in this country. He commenced by comparing the election outcome to the 1998 election. I thought that was a good idea. In the 1998 election, John Howard lost 18 seats, received the minority of the vote, but won the majority of the seats and became the Prime Minister. Now, in 1998, then opposition leader Kim Beazley delivered what I would regard as one of the great speeches in history, a very generous speech, despite the fact he'd received the majority of the vote and lost. And this is what Mr Beazley said, in uplifting words to the people of Australia back in 1998. He said, "We must as a people turn to each other and not on each other or against each other." Now, by contrast, about 2/3 of the Prime Minister's speech that night, only 2.5 months ago, was spent attacking the Labor Party and all of the people who supported it. He effectively accused 49.64% of the electorate who voted Labor of being involved, and I quote, "in a pretty shameful episode in Australia's history, with more than a few people misled by systemic, well-funded lies." Whack. Whack to 49% of the Australian electorate. Now, as I watched this tantrum unfold, and I just got home from my own election function, and I watched it unfold, I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but I was reminded of an old comic strip where the Lord of the Manor is speaking to one of his servants. And the servant says, "Sire, sire, the peasants are revolting." And the Lord of the Manor replies, "Yes, they are, aren't they?" And that is the attitude of our Prime Minister. He thinks that he is here to rule over the peasantry. That's what he thinks. He wanted to blame the people of Australia for not having the brilliance to understand what an important politician he was. And of course that's why we do call him the Prince from Point Piper. He's little different from Mitt Romney in the United States, the last Republican candidate for the presidency of that country, who spoke about the 47% of voters who would never support him, to quote him saying, because they thought government has a responsibility to take care of them. Where does that take us? That really takes us back to the attitude of the modern Liberal Party, which has been radicalised and taken over by these United States-type Tea Party people, and I know the Nationals understand that. They spent a lot of time fighting it. And only a Tea Party could have gone to the election expecting the Australian people to support a $50 billion unfunded corporate tax cut. Just truly spectacular. Of course, that's because, and we heard it from the member for Hughes, their storyline is all Ayn Rand. The whole world just consists of the lifters and the leaners, and now it's the taxed and the tax-nots. You know, it's so stupid you couldn't make it up. But that is the world that these people live in these days, these radicalised, extreme Tea Partiers who are now running the government's economic policy. And of course, I know the Prime Minister probably doesn't understand it, because in his world, as he spoke to the people during the campaign, as he stood on his balcony there at Point Piper and looked across at the 4 wealthiest electorates in the country, he doesn't really walk in the same shopping aisles as the average Australian. Therefore, he doesn't get the very basis of why his message is so unappealing at the grassroots level. You know, in his world, people just go to the doctor because it's free, not because they need to go there. In his world, workers' wages are always too high. In his world, business regulation is simply out of control, we shouldn't have any more. And of course, the tax-nots out there are dragging down everybody else, unless, of course, they're big multinational companies who are evading tax and don't pay anything at all. So, for this Prime Minister to come into this House and lecture people here and in the community about the moral challenges that we face, the moral challenges of debt, when he's giving a $50 billion unfunded tax cut to some of the wealthiest companies in the world, who are not going to change their behaviour and take the gift and come back and reinvest here and drive jobs and growth. For him to lecture Australians on moral cowardice or the Labor Party like that is simply breathtaking. A corporate tax cut of this magnitude is not even in the 10 most important actions you'd take if you were really trying to power jobs and growth in the circumstances we are in here in Australia, given the context of the international economy. And particularly so, and I wish the member for Hughes had stayed, because I want to demonstrate why it is such an act of stupidity, an act of wealth concentration, not an act of wealth creation, to offer a $50 billion unfunded tax cut of that nature. Now, thankfully, Labor, one of our last acts in office, was to put in place tax transparency legislation which forced the corporates to publish total income, taxable income and total tax paid. So now we know what's going on in that area. And of course, the effective or the average effective rate of tax paid in Australia is not 30%, it's 24%. It's 24%. And if you're a private country, a private company, not a public company, it's actually 19%. So forget all this rubbish about 30% and somehow they're 12 here and 15 there. We don't pay 30% in this country. There's some valid reasons for it, and there's some very, very squalid explanations of it for many of our large corporates. So why would cutting the corporate rate to 30%, from 30% to 25%, work in an environment where they're paying an effective rate on average of 24%? It's just stupid, dumb, which is why it doesn't have the support. It is not seen by bodies such as the IMF and many international organisations as a rational choice at all. Would all those companies be suddenly inspired to create more jobs? 1 in 3 private companies in Australia now pay no tax. Get that? No tax. And 1 in 3 private companies pay no tax, and 1 in 4 public companies pay no tax. How are they going to be inspired to invest more when they're not paying anything now at all? Which is yet another demonstration of how absurd this policy is and why, really, the government is being controlled by a pack of zealots who are simply interested in providing a huge gift to a few of their mates at the top end of town. Meanwhile, the average member of the public can see through this. They can see through it thanks to our tax transparency legislation. Everyday workers don't have access to Panamanian tax shelters or tax havens or corporate minimisation opportunities. So how dare these workers challenge the Prime Minister on election night and say, no thanks, we don't think it's a great idea? And how can anyone have faith in a leader who professes to believe in equality of opportunity but leads a government that's opposed strong measures to stamp out tax evasion? Now, he can lecture all he likes about the moral challenges. He is a fully paid-up member of the Cayman Islands Club. He's got a capital fund growing there under the palm trees. How is he in a position to lecture Australians about their moral priorities? If he was a leader who had faith in his leadership, if he was a leader that had faith in his treasurer, he would be investing his money first and foremost here. The truth is this: the use of tax havens by wealthy corporates and wealthy individuals is destroying progressive taxation as we know it. And it is a very significant factor, not just in growing inequality of wealth and income globally, but it's a significant factor in the loss of trust across the world by individuals in their democracies, and it is also a substantial factor leading to weaker and anaemic growth and lower living standards across both the developed and the developing world. You don't go to a tax haven unless you're intending to either avoid tax, either in countries where you live or you're based, or to use it as an endpoint for tax minimisation. The fact is the public know it, that strong action against tax havens will never be taken by public officials who use them. Now, we had a lecture in question time today from the Prime Minister once again about culture. He decided he was going to lecture the Labor Party about culture. So I've got a question for him. What kind of Prime Minister puts his fortune in a tax haven? What sort of cultural implications does that have for our country and for moral leadership? So in this environment, you can be absolutely certain that the public are indeed very sceptical when the government says it is committed to Medicare, that they don't have an agenda to privatise it, which we know they do, and by the way, which is still being implemented behind the scenes. I'm sure their backbenchers will be shocked to know. So we have in Australia an opportunity to have a debate about what are the drivers of growth with equity. And of course this is why in the Labor Party we've produced this report. This shows the way. We've reached a fork in the road in the economic debate. We can grow inclusively, and if we're growing fairly, we will grow more strongly. If we're growing unfairly, we will have weaker growth. Order. This is the way ahead, not the government's trickle-down economics.
Order. The member's time has